to today's episode of the SE Sherm Podcast, Putting the Human in Business. This podcast is part of the SE Sherm chapter, the premier organization for HR and talent professionals in the Sioux Empire, Midwest, and beyond.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sioux Empire Sherm Podcast. I'm Colleen, and with me is JR. Say hello, JR.
Hello, JR. Happy Friday, everyone.
Yeah, happy Friday, TGIF. So today's speaker we have with us, we have Sommer Mason. She is a dynamic total rewards leader with over 25 years of experience helping organizations build competitive, high-impact HR strategies. Since joining Gallagher in 2016, she's guided clients across industries ranging from manufacturing and energy to healthcare and education through complex challenges in compensation, benefits, and talent. Sommer is a certified compensation professional and Lean Six Sigma Green Belt, known for combining data-driven insights with practical strategies to attract and retain top talent. She holds a degree in Management Information Systems from Louisiana Tech University and is based near Baton Rouge. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. We're excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. So I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So to have a little bit of fun and to get everything rolling, we like to do a little icebreaker. So just curious, what is your favorite hidden gem spot in Louisiana that tourists usually miss?
Well, of course, New Orleans. That's a lot of places or a place where a lot of people go. But I mean, I'm from the Baton Rouge area, so we love to just, go around and eat at different places. If you haven't, most people go to New Orleans. If you haven't gone to Baton Rouge, there are some really great places to eat. And, I love to do go somewhere for dessert, maybe go somewhere for entree, just go to different places. The food is amazing here. So if you're in New Orleans, swing by Baton Rouge and try out some of our restaurants.
How far is Baton Rouge from New Orleans?
It's about an hour. So It depends, what part of Baton Rouge you're coming from and what part of New Orleans you're going to, but about an hour.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've been to New Orleans and I had such a great time trying, I think it was fried oysters, and which I didn't even know was a thing.
And I should have prefaced this podcast with no talking about food because I am just starving now. Every time I was talking to somebody at work and just when it comes to Louisiana, they talk about food. I love seafood incredibly, mostly get it Florida. I've never been to Louisiana, certainly not New Orleans or Baton Rouge anywhere, but I just hear so much about it. And oh my gosh, I'm already starving hearing it because it's I should have bbeen there by now. I'm kicking myself.
Well, everyone that moves here, they say that they put on at least 10, 15, 20 pounds because it's just, you have to try all the different places. There's so many.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say outside of food, JR, is a bucket list item is to go to an LSU football game and go to a night game. We have an RV, we tailgate, we do all that. So everything's about food and fun. And, that's a great experience too. So if you can do that, that would be the other little hidden gem, I would say.
Oh, good deal. Well, I certainly
save
love
you maybe a few pounds.
Seafood and definitely going to take it up when we get down there. So, excited to jump into today's conversation, and we got a lot of areas to talk about, and I think a lot will fall under that job architecture or sort of job classification umbrella. We're probably going to be talking at different levels here, but love to get your take first as to how do you define job architecture, or considering our listeners, what is a maybe 30,000 foot view of how they could understand it, and feel free to delve into job classification as well.
Yeah. So, it can at times be a little complex and hard to understand. And there is some differences and nuances in each. When people hear job architecture, they often think big, like complicated corporate project. And for smaller employers and organizations, that's not where we need to necessarily start. There's areas that we could start with that are more basic, like, what kind of jobs do we have? What are people doing in those jobs? And do we have job descriptions that make sense and align with what our people are doing? And then our titles and expectations clear of those roles. That's the fundamentals and the foundational work that should be done that allows us to scale everything else. So we can start with that and then grow into a job architecture project.
I know I've worked firsthand myself in tweaking and updating and maintaining and auditing those quite a bit. One thing I'd love to hear too is sort of your take or even definition of job classification, because that's where I've seen it occur more. I've done some larger job architecture projects, but again, really want to keep thinking of our audience and some of those smaller to medium-sized organizations where job classification might be a little more applicable. So give us your take on that and definition, if you will.
Yeah, so I'm going to go over that and really clarify the difference between, say, cleanup versus classification versus job architecture. And I'd like to explain those three different layers because through explaining those, it will explain what job classification is. The first thing is job cleanup is really that first practical step. That's where you look at what exists today in your job titling and infrastructure. That's where you start to fix what's unclear, maybe what's outdated, duplicated, inconsistent. That means cleaning up job descriptions. It means looking at roles that have maybe drifted over time and we need to kind of fix titles. I always love when you have sometimes you might have manager spelled out, or you may have it at the end of a title or the beginning, or you may have it abbreviated. Mm-hmm. And when you think about reporting and pulling data, that makes it challenging because you're not using consistency. It's that's very frustrating and challenging, right? So just small things like that. But job classification is that more, other than just cleanup, right? The structured step. So that's where you start grouping jobs logically based upon what they do, the scope of work, their level of responsibility. And it helps to answer basic questions like, what jobs do we really have? What are they? What do we need? Which ones are similar in maybe role or responsibility? Which ones are very different? And so that's where you start really kind of starting to classify them. So you have cleanup first, then classification, and then that job architecture is that bigger framework. And that's where you start organizing jobs across the company into more intentional model, like with job families, levels, progressions, logic, clear titling and all of that. So you can do all that prep work and clean up and classification before you get to that. And most smaller organizations would not start with that full architecture. They'd start with the cleanup first because that's the organization. Start with the philosophy, job descriptions, cleaning up, role clarity. That will give you the foundation to then build on later.
So I guess next step here, when we have everything classified, or maybe it's not yet classified, smaller organizations or smaller teams, we talk about the accidental manager phenomenon, which, I think listening to how you just talked about classification architecture, if it's not clearly defined, we end up with someone who maybe shouldn't be a manager or vice versa, somebody who maybe should. How do we make sure those roles are clear? How can we stop that phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a fun one, right? This is probably the most common issue that I see, especially in organizations that are growing. Someone may be excellent technically. They may be highly reliable, really good at that individual contributor and excel. Maybe they were one of the earliest employees that came onto the company, or they were just really great at what they did. And then we move them into a management role, but we've not proactively prepared them for that potentially. So there could be a role issue. It could be a training and development issue. There could be multiple things there that's going on. But the manager role itself, let's say, was never really clearly defined. We just said, okay, great. You're great at what you're doing. You're a manager now, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where we get into the accidental manager problem. It's the person that may be great at what they were doing, the work, but no one really classified and defined what leading people requires. So how does that role look different from maybe a senior individual contributor? Or what was the success? How do we define success? And what does that look like in management? Job architecture, or even good, foundational role structure, cleanup and classification, that all helps because it forces the organization to define the role before promoting into it. And that's the key, because if you promote someone into it before you defined it, it's not setting up the organization to be successful with those roles, and it's not setting up the individual to be successful in that role. So what I like to do is answer questions like, what is a manager here? How do we define a manager? And then take it even more, supervisor versus manager versus director, and, executive leadership. What are the differences in those roles? What are the competencies? What are the decision-making authority that comes with that role? So those are the type of things that we consider, what people, leadership expectations come with it. How different is it to lead than it is to be in that senior specialist role? That's the clarity that really helps companies make better promotion decisions. And it also helps employees understand whether they want that next step too, because if they don't really truly understand the role, what it entails, they may not want that. So it just all around is best for the company and the employee.
Yeah. And I think that's a big piece of not just for managers, but for employees to understand, because I think we can all think of probably a handful of people who, I'm the best worker you've got. Why haven't I been promoted? But in the same breath, it's like, well, you don't really have the people skills, or there does need to be some sort of people skill, empathy, being able to lead a team without ruffling a bunch of feathers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it goes from being reactive to proactive. So if you think about it from a succession planning perspective, if we can identify individuals and their capabilities, skill sets, and gaps, and then giving them an idea of what that next step would be. Are you interested in that next step? Are you ready? Probably have some gaps. Let's talk about those gaps. Develop you in those gap areas to better set you up for a successful promotion. And then also helping you understand the role and defining it so that they have that role clarity to be successful as well. The role really should outlive the individual too, right? So that's where we don't want to just put somebody in a role just because and not having that role defined. It should be built into the infrastructure as a part of a need within the organization through that individual moving into it, whether that individual, moves up from there or out, that core role will be developed proactively to help support the organization and the individuals overall.
My mind goes a lot towards job analysis and just kind of that key phrase. I had literally an entire semester, a single class just dedicated, and it was titled Job Analysis. To know that, because of a lot of what you're saying, sets it up for how do you recruit, how do you train, how do you reward and merit, how do you advance, promote. All of that stems from that, and I think goes into that. Are there any job analysis best practices, methods, considerations, things that you can, little cheat sheets or pointers, takeaways, nuggets for our listeners? I think that would help, because I know a lot are typically evaluating or creating job descriptions even from scratch.
Yeah. So for job analysis, it all starts with, first of all, I would say your philosophy, right? You've got to have the philosophy defined, because if you don't, garbage in, garbage out. We typically want to start with the philosophy document. That's going to define who we're competing against, who we are losing people to, where are we hiring from. Through that, we're going to then be able to assess what our competition is. So if we're looking at industry specifically itself, maybe geographic location, maybe organization size. So those are typically the areas that will pull market data, defining that within the philosophy itself first. So that will guide us. Then when we're pulling the philosophy or looking at the philosophy, we know how we want to benchmark jobs. The benchmarking piece is very important. And this is where I say this, garbage in, garbage out situation. So if you're not selecting the correct matches in benchmarking, the results of that job analysis is not going to be good. So making sure you're having job descriptions that are clear, defined in what they are actually doing, the role that's actually being done. And if you have good job descriptions, that's where you then go out to your different survey sources, benchmark those jobs in the surveys to validate that you have good matches. You can compare the different sources, validate the summaries of those with your job description. But that's key, is that benchmarking piece. Yes, considering philosophy, but that benchmarking, if you're not matching up the right jobs in the market with your job description, the results of the analysis is not going to be it's not going to be right. So you won't be able to have good data there. That's the output. But that's the key to me, is it starts with the job description, the benchmarking process, validating accuracy there, pulling the right data, and then the output will be, the analysis will be a good, thorough output.
I know a lot of people that have taken a deep dive into this for a lot of compensation or salary surveys and some of that benchmarking, the external needs for it. But say you're not doing that. I see a lot of, job descriptions or classifications architectures get, just sit on a shelf or in, the file folder on your computer for quite a few years. Because if you're not externally benchmarking, what do you recommend for time frame in terms of revisiting those? Just as a best practice, say you have a few hundred employees, for that size of a company.
Yeah. So best practice in benchmarking. First of all, like I said, what I've just shared, making sure you're following those steps. But when you're benchmarking, validate the data that you're pulling is good data, meaning that it's not self-reported employee data. It's not, just online Googling. You want to have it as third-party administered industry-specific data, which means it would be safe harbor data. In that case, it would be administered by a third party. It would be data points that are at least 3 months old and at least 5 data points that are aggregated. And you want ideally 3 to 5 different survey sources when you are collecting that data. So if you only have one and you can only find one, then you use that. But best case scenario, you have multiple sources that are those types of surveys that I just mentioned. And then you aggregate those together to then have a total range, base and bonus. So total cash comp will give you the data that we generally look at. And this process of benchmarking ideally is over a 3-year period, which is textbook. So some clients will do beginning of year 1, benchmark all the jobs that have data. Rule of thumb, about 80% of your jobs would expect to have benchmarking data available, and then you would slot those other positions that do not have data available. But doing that full benchmarking process beginning of year 1, having your salary structure, grading those positions. Year 2, you then adjust your structures based upon what we're seeing market move, which is generally about, prior to COVID, it was like 2.8% for 20 years or so. Of course, COVID hit, and then we shot up to like 10, 15%. We've normalized now since then back to about 3%. So let's say we're still around 3%. We adjust structures 3%. So your minimum, midpoint, and max all move up 3%. You then look at what your merit budget is, adjustments that you're going to make. You make those accordingly based upon what that structure has moved, but also considering things like performance, maybe, additional certifications, or maybe it's tenure or experience or whatever, but culturally within your organization, what you've defined as how you want to address pay for those individuals. Typically, I say those that are top key roles, the roles that you need in the organization to keep the doors open. You want to focus on those. Maybe hot jobs that you're losing people from. AI is a hot topic now. If you've got people with that skill set and you want to make sure you don't lose them, it's very important to the organization. That's another way. Top performers, keeping and retaining top performers, and those that are low in the range. So let's say you have somebody in one of those key roles is a top performer, has been here for many years, and is low in the range. That's someone you want to put your money towards, right? So making sure you do adjustments the years in between. So that would be beginning of year 2, beginning of year 3, do the same thing. And then beginning of year 4, do a full benchmarking again. Again, that's textbook, but that's not always how it happens. Sometimes there are things we have that occur. You may have acquisition. You may have different things that come up that require you to visit that more often. With that, also visiting your philosophy to make sure it's in line every year. You should review that on an annual basis as well. So that's kind of that best practice textbook approach. I will say some clients will also, rather than doing all the benchmark jobs up front, maybe to space it out over a 3-year period, they'll do a third of the jobs starting with their core jobs. Let's say you're in healthcare. They may want to do all the clinical positions or RNs or whatever it may be. Year 1, year 2 would be a third of the other jobs. And then year 3 would be the remaining third. And then you have an ongoing cycle that way. So that's another way you could do it as well.
So that sounds like for, let's say a larger corporation, right? Or larger business. So what about the smaller businesses, smaller employers? Where should they start if they don't really have any structure?
Yeah. So for smaller organizations, if you're looking, let's say under 50 employees, right? Let's say under 50, they may not need to have like a salary structure in place. Typically in that size below, you can do strict market pricing, which means You validate what the value of the job is out in the market by using salary surveys. You may not need to do that internal equity piece, which is the salary structure and grading positions, because you have fewer jobs. You can manage a true strict market pricing approach for smaller organizations. So that may be one thing, is that they don't have to do that salary structure. They could get away with just do market pricing. The key though is then you start getting into compression issues to where people came on years ago and we've not adjusted their pay. And that salary structure does help with making sure that you're adjusting pay and you're addressing compression. Whenever, like, compression being maybe a manager and an individual contributor are pretty much butted up next to each other in pay and making the same, similar, or maybe the manager's even making less than the employee because the employee was recently hired. So you just want to make sure, if you're doing strict market pay, that you're addressing that compression and you're looking at the individuals in those roles on an annual basis. 50 to, above 50, I would say that's where you really start needing to look at putting in a salary structure, where you can put in grades and ranges. But linking this back to like the architecture, the titling, the structure of jobs itself, I kind of approach it like Maslow's hierarchy. It's kind of that food, shelter, and water, right? You don't want it to get to where it's so complex. It's a cost benefit analysis of being so complex to where it's hard to administer, and you really don't need all that, versus something that's simple, makes sense, and puts in fair and equitable pay practices. So before an organization gets into advanced things or more advanced things like competencies or full career frameworks or salary structures, I say, let's do the basic survival needs first. And through that, you can address the core food, shelter, and water of things that you need. So that's where I'd start. There are 5 practical steps that, I'd go through. Like, first, philosophy we talked about. Second, inventorying your jobs. So what jobs do we have today? Not just looking at the org chart, but what are people really doing, as I talked about earlier. Third would be cleaning up the job descriptions themselves. So then going in, making sure that they align with what, they're really doing in the organization. What roles are critical, starting with those. And then fourth, doing the cleanup of the titles. And then fifth, over time, that's where you start grouping the jobs logically and growing more structure as the company grows. And you'll have the fundamentals of that food, shelter, and water in place so that when you do grow, you can expand it and scale it. But that's really the core of how I would separate smaller organizations versus mid and large, and how to approach it through that type of process.
I love how you're using Maslow's. I don't know why, but I feel like it paints a really good picture of, the structure. But not only that, but maybe the buzzwords come back from Maslow, because I've heard that so many times over the last couple of months, and I'm like, I know what that is. No.
Well, and it's easy to understand that way, right? We kind of all know that back from our education.
The pyramid structure, I think, I'm trying to think even just at previous employers that I've looked at: job families, then position families, then job families, then, individual jobs or roles or positions. And that's kind of that hierarchy. I've seen it typically more as like a tree branch, or almost like a position hierarchy or organizational hierarchy, never in a pyramid structure. And I think it probably could make way more sense in a pyramid, just for people to kind of understand and conceptualize that a bit more. On that note, I did want to ask, because I have worked with organizations that, hundreds or thousands of employers, and I do want to keep this in mind for our audience too, for more of the smaller organizations. But I have seen a job description for every 2.5 to 3 employees, and have had to kind of pare that down. Love to hear, I'm guessing you've seen some examples with different clients where they just about have a separate job description for every single employee. And how do you kind of pare that back down to reality, to what makes most sense for an organization or a business?
Are you talking about like when they build a position around a person type thing, or like?
I think you had mentioned, say, an ER nurse. Say you have a job description for one type of ER nurse, and then you have a separate job description for another nurse in the ER, just because their roles differ a little bit, and
skill
what's maybe
set.
that criteria or threshold to say like,
Yeah.
well, these are 90% the same, or you got an 80-20 rule going on here. Do we really need multiple job descriptions? And then that's more to manage,
Yeah.
that source of truth, that entity. Any thoughts around that as to where you find that happy middle ground, that
Yeah.
balance?
So, Colin, it's interesting that you asked that question specifically, because that is oftentimes an issue, is that we set up roles based upon people. We have a friend or somebody we know, we like them, we want to bring them in. And so we create a role, we move them into that role. But that doesn't support the organization on an ongoing basis. It's not scalable. If that person leaves, if there's not the need for that role, it becomes a challenge. But oftentimes that's why we see a lot of job titles, is because we've grown through that rather than business need. And so that becomes a challenge in itself. But with that said, it also, to go back to your original question, JR, it depends on the industry. We do see oftentimes with certain industries where there may be more or lesser roles. Some that have the lesser headcount of roles, it's probably because they have a huge workforce in a certain area. For example, healthcare, maybe RNs, or if it's a construction organization, it may be like a plumber, and there's like 75 plumbers in that plumber title, right? So those type of industry trends you'll see. And then you have others you typically see, like more privately held, family owned organizations that will have a lot of individual titles because of the example or, comment that Colleen made. But with that, what I would say is, what is the magic number? How do we know what's ideal? And again, it goes back to, what do you need from the organization's perspective? What are the business needs in the role? What do we also see externally in market data for similar organizations? So what do an organization our size, our industry, how many levels and titles do we typically see in those type of organizations? So I would then reflect on survey data and different levels and progressions and all of that. Of course, as far as levels in a progression, let's say you have, an example, you have an accountant type role. You have 3 job titles. You have an accountant, a senior accountant, and a staff accountant. Well, when we look at it, there's really a 2-level progression, because the staff accountant and the accountant title, we just created 2 jobs that were pretty much the same, and put 2 different employees in those 2 jobs. But in reality, it's probably just an accountant and a senior accountant. And that's where we create that 2-level progression and then put those 3 people in those 2 jobs. That's an example of where we create a job when somebody comes in, and that's how an additional level is added. Not to say you shouldn't have levels. I mean, you should. You want promotional opportunities, but you don't want to have so many where it's hard to administer. You don't want to have none where, you don't have promotional opportunity. But you do, it goes back to the job. Validating the job has clear definition, roles, responsibility, experience, all of that. And then those progressions and titles are created based upon that. So it all goes back to the job description. And then aligning what you may see in market, like organizations. And I'm sure there's always some that could be cut. And we do see some that don't have enough. We have some that have too many. And that's where we tend to come and play and help to look at what is best practice. And we can give that a guidance, but sometimes there's a little bit of art that plays into that too, because, they may want to have a fuller progression so that people can be developed. And some people want it very flat and not have those levels, but it is a common challenge.
Yeah, I've definitely seen organizations really detail out the knowledge, skills, abilities for each of those levels, a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 for the same job description. And some of it gets a little tedious, but at the same time, It's very, very clearly objective to hiring managers, to incumbents in those roles. And so, I can see the pros and cons with both. In terms of housing job descriptions, I've had examples where, an updated job description is actually, sitting on a hiring manager's computer, or another one is sitting in, on HR's computer. Or what do you, any tips, tricks, or recommendations for how to keep that source of truth, how to best house, job descriptions and architecture so we know we're working from that real source of truth?
Yeah. So, there's systems that you can put in place, and depending upon size of organization and, budget and technology that you're able to put in place. it's really nice if you can build something that's a shareable workplace within, especially the keepers of the job descriptions. So if you have like a, at a minimum, this reminds me just doing shared folders is like back in the 90s, right? Where that's how we did everything, is just had share folders. But at a minimum of that, if you have some type of sharing of a centralized workplace where you can put them in and categorizing them in a good way that's easy to search and access, I mean, that's kind of the first step. If you could even take that even up a notch, if you have access to like SharePoint or those types of tools internal to the network to put them out there as well, that would be good too. And you can access them there. The challenge is that you want to have the process defined, because you don't want to have it open to where anybody can open them and make changes, right? So I would recommend finding a central repository to put them, but making sure those permissions and the process is defined so that if HR is the owner of those job descriptions, only those could be, those individuals can update it, right? So typically I like an annual review of the job descriptions. We actually use what's called a PDQ, or position description questionnaire, which is basically a questionnaire for job description. Validating employee is saying, yes, these are the things that we do in this role, then having manager validate, and then coming to HR to review, finalize, save. And that's that final save draft that I would recommend saving. But going through that process annually is ideal. And also before you get to your benchmarking and all of that, of course, right? You want the calendar year to be at the right time to then move into your compensation planning and analysis. But there's also technology out there, like within HRIS systems or ERP systems, where you might be able to house them, or like succession planning systems, development, LMSs, you could potentially house them out there. But however you save them, to me, what's most important is that process of updating and making sure that you look at them on an annual basis at a minimum.
So I know we're all really excited now to hit the ground running, especially our people that maybe they've never heard of job architecture before. What is the best way to get our managers, our business owners on board with us as HR business partners for job architecture, job classification, job cleanup, all that?
Yeah, well, the biggest advice I'd give HR is do not start with the phrase job architecture or start throwing that out. Will like quickly turn people off. I mean, from HR compensation, people like, we love throwing around phrases that are textbook and that make a lot of sense to us. But just in me working in this, I see there are people that really don't really understand the differences between them all, or even frankly care, right? They really, what I see the best way to approach this is to approach it from a business pain point perspective. So leadership fills those pain points. For example, you might approach it like this. You might say, we are making some pay and promotion decisions, but we're doing them one at a time. And we need to have a framework to do that so that we have consistent titling, so that we're hiring with role clarity, so that employees understand their role when they come on. Maybe it's helping managers define and understand those expectations differently. It's growth, making our structure, as we grow, it's harder to manage. So those are all ways that you could approach it from a business perspective rather than HR terminology. And that what that does is it takes that conversation from an HR project of doing a job architecture project to a business infrastructure conversation. So I'd frame it like this. This is about us helping the organization to hire better, to have more clarity and accountability in the roles, making more consistent decisions, making us scalable more effectively. But those are the ways I would approach it. So it's not about the org chart. It's about making the business run better. And that's how you approach it.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. So I can move on with the rapid fire. So just to wrap it up, kind of a little fun thing. Don't overthink it. Yeah. Just say whatever comes to mind first. So, all right. Just 5 questions. Coffee or Coke?
Coffee.
Coffee. Okay. French Quarter or Gulf Coast?
French Quarter.
Okay. Mardi Gras or Festival International?
Mardi Gras, 100%.
Mardi Gras. Okay.
Yeah.
Gumbo or jambalaya?
Ooh, now that one. If it's cold, gumbo. If it's hot, jambalaya.
I've never
Season-wise.
heard of eating it cold. Oh, okay.
Oh.
Well, I mean, if the weather's cold. So if it's cold outside, I mean, yeah.
Gotcha.
If
I
it's
was like,
wet,
oh,
then
eating
I'm
it
eating,
cold.
yeah, then I'm eating
You're
jambalaya.
like,
So
you're like, no, outside temperature.
yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah,
All
outside.
right. Gators or snapping turtles?
To eat?
For a pet. I mean, whatever you want to do.
Whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can handle both. I mean, I actually have them in my around my house, and they come up in our drains. And I was driving down the street the other day, and I'm not exaggerating. There was a 12-foot alligator on the side of the road that somebody had run over, and so it's like they're just everyday part of our life.
Wow.
I could handle both.
They're like
I probably
possums.
see
Then.
alligator more
run
often
them
than
over.
the snapping turtle. I'm sorry. Say that again.
I said they're just like possums. You just kind of run them over, I guess, right? Like
Yeah.
they're in your way. You don't see them.
I mean,
because there's so many of them.
Neutral rats. I mean, there's waterways all around us, so they literally are like in the drains, and have a little kind of bayou in the front of my neighborhood, so we see them out there all the time. Actually, yesterday I got out of my car and saved a turtle and put it over in the water. So that's just everyday life here. Yeah,
I love it. I mean, they seem like they'd be scary, but I guess like most people say they're kind of like dogs. Like they just kind of leave you alone and wander around.
Yeah. Well, what's scary is when they're in the neighborhood and then you have dogs and they live to their environment. So if they're in the neighborhood, they're probably smaller, but we do have larger waterways, and that's where they come out, where they're really big. Like if you've watched Swamp People and that kind of stuff, like that's real. That's, but around us, they're smaller, but you have to worry about, my dog getting snatched up. So
yeah, they might not eat you.
Definitely
they're not going
different.
to eat us.
Gosh, I even think of like children. Say you have, a child that's like 3-4 years old, like, oh, they want to go play in the little pond,
yes, like
or on the edge of the pond, like,
watch your kids.
Yeah, not something.
Yeah,
just different way of life for sure. But we all have it in different geographies, right? So
we definitely do. Especially if you're around waterways, you got to watch them.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on our podcast today, Sommer. It was really fun. For everyone listening, you can connect with Sommer on LinkedIn. It's Sommer-Mason-CCP-9365128. That's all we got for today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.